Thousands of years, ancient Egypt spoke to the world. Its temples were covered in symbols. Its monuments were filled with carved messages. Its walls told stories of gods, kings, life, death, and the cosmos. And then, Egypt went silent. For more than 1,400 years, no one on earth could read a single line of hieroglyphs. Not priests, not scholars, not kings. The messages were still there, carved in stone, but their meaning was completely lost. And that silence is where the mystery truly begins. When the Roman Empire absorbed Egypt, the old religion slowly disappeared. Temples were closed, priests vanished, and with them the last people who understood the ancient writing system. Hieroglyphs were no longer taught, no longer spoken, no longer passed on. They became nothing more than beautiful images with no voice. During the Middle Ages, Europeans looked at hieroglyphs and guessed wildly. Some believed they were magical symbols, secret codes from gods, mystical pictures hiding divine truths. Others thought they were philosophical metaphors, pure symbolism, a language never meant to be read aloud. One thing everyone agreed on was this: hieroglyphs were not a real language. And that assumption was wrong. The biggest mistake wasn't ignorance, it was confidence. For centuries, scholars believed they already understood how hieroglyphs worked. Without being able to read even one sentence, they tried to interpret meaning without sound, to understand language without grammar, to translate a civilization without knowing its voice. Egypt wasn't silent because it had nothing to say. It was silent because no one was listening correctly. By the 18th century, Egypt became fashionable again. Explorers, artists, and scholars flooded the Nile. Temples were sketched, statues were copied, symbols were collected, but still, no one could read them. Imagine standing in front of a wall of text, knowing it contains prayers, laws, names, and histories, and realizing you are completely locked out. That was ancient Egypt, a civilization visible to everyone, yet intellectually unreachable. Then came a turning point, not through brilliance at first, but through chance. In 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, soldiers stumbled upon a dark stone slab covered in writing. It didn't look special at first, but it carried something the world had never seen before. The same text, written 3 times, in 3 different scripts. This artifact would later be known as the Rosetta Stone. And without anyone realizing it yet, ancient Egypt had just whispered again, for the first time in over a millennium. At the time, scholars were excited, but confused. They could read the Greek section easily. They recognized the Demotic script as a later Egyptian form. But hieroglyphs? Still considered symbolic, still considered mystical, still considered unreadable. The key was in front of them, but no one knew which door it belonged to. This is the moment most people misunderstand history. They assume once the Rosetta Stone was found, hieroglyphs were immediately translated. That's not what happened. Years passed. Experts failed. Theories collapsed. Because everyone was still asking the wrong question. They were trying to interpret meaning, instead of asking how the language actually worked. The real breakthrough wouldn't come from archaeology alone. It would come from linguistics, from obsession, from someone willing to break every accepted rule about ancient Egypt. Someone who believed hieroglyphs were not just symbols, but sounds. And when that realization finally happened, ancient Egypt didn't just start speaking again. It spoke clearly. In 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, French soldiers were reinforcing a fort near the town of Rosetta. They weren't searching for ancient secrets. They weren't thinking about lost languages. They were building defenses. And that makes what they found even more extraordinary. A large, dark stone slab, broken at the top, covered in unfamiliar writing. At first, it seemed like just another artifact in a land full of ruins. But soon, scholars realized something unusual. The same message appeared 3 times, in 3 different scripts. This artifact would become known as the Rosetta Stone, and without anyone realizing it yet, it carried the possibility of ending Egypt's long silence. The stone contained, at the top, hieroglyphs. In the middle, a flowing Egyptian script known today as Demotic. At the bottom, Greek. For the first time in history, scholars could read one part of an ancient Egyptian inscription with certainty. The Greek text described a royal decree issued in honor of a ruler. It was clear, precise, and fully understandable. That alone made the stone invaluable. Because if the texts were truly identical, then hieroglyphs were no longer isolated symbols. They were connected to language, or so it seemed. At first, optimism spread across Europe. Surely this was it. Surely the mystery would be solved within years. But years passed, and nothing happened. The stone was copied, studied, debated, and hieroglyphs remained unreadable. Why? Because scholars were still trapped in the same invisible cage. They believed hieroglyphs were sacred symbols, not speech. They tried to translate meaning directly from images. A bird was interpreted as a soul, a sun disk as divinity, a snake as power or eternity. The result? Beautiful theories, completely unusable translations. They weren't reading a language. They were projecting philosophy onto stone. There was another, deeper reason for failure. Hieroglyphs had never been designed for society at large. For most of ancient Egyptian history, ordinary people couldn't read them. Literacy was limited. Sacred writing belonged to temples. The knowledge of how hieroglyphs worked wasn't written down as instructions. It was carried by people. And when the Egyptian temple system collapsed under Roman rule, that chain broke. No teachers, no initiates, no living memory, only symbols, frozen in stone. So when European scholars finally held the Rosetta Stone, they held a key, but had no idea what kind of lock it belonged to. Then, quietly, a different approach emerged. Not from a general, not from a priest, not from an established academic authority, but from a linguist. His name was Jean-François Champollion. And unlike most scholars of his time, he didn't start with symbols. He started with sound. Champollion noticed something others dismissed. In the Greek text, royal names appeared clearly. Those same names appeared in the hieroglyphic text, enclosed in oval shapes known as cartouches. Instead of asking what the symbols meant, he asked a simpler question. What if these symbols spelled names? Names don't translate. They are transcribed. That single idea challenged centuries of belief. Because if hieroglyphs could spell foreign names, then they weren't purely symbolic. They were phonetic. At first, this idea was controversial, even offensive. Hieroglyphs were considered sacred, mystical, too divine to behave like ordinary language. Champollion didn't deny their symbolism, but he argued something revolutionary, that Egyptian writing was a complex system combining meaning, symbolism, and sound. A real language, not magic. At this stage, nothing was fully proven yet. Champollion hadn't unlocked everything. Egypt was not suddenly readable. But for the first time in over 1,000 years, someone was asking the right questions. The Rosetta Stone was no longer just a curiosity. It was becoming a voice. Ancient Egypt had waited centuries for someone willing to listen differently. And that moment was finally approaching. In the next part, we'll follow how Champollion broke the code and what ancient Egypt revealed once it began to speak. His name was Jean-François Champollion, and unlike most scholars of his time, he didn't approach ancient Egypt as a mystery to be interpreted. He approached it as a language waiting to be heard. Champollion was born in 1790 in France. From an early age, he showed an unusual obsession with languages. By his teenage years, he had already studied Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac. But one language fascinated him more than all the others: Coptic. At the time, Coptic was considered a dead liturgical language, used mainly in Christian rituals in Egypt. But Champollion believed something radical. He believed Coptic was not a foreign language at all. He believed it was the last living descendant of ancient Egyptian. That idea would change everything. While other scholars focused almost exclusively on symbols and images, Champollion focused on sound, how words were pronounced, how languages evolved, how meaning shifted over centuries. To him, hieroglyphs were not frozen symbols, they were traces of speech. When Champollion studied the Rosetta Stone, he didn't start with theology or philosophy. He started with names. In the Greek text, the name Ptolemaios appeared clearly. In the hieroglyphic text, there was a cartouche, an oval frame containing a sequence of symbols. Champollion asked a question that had been ignored for decades. What if that cartouche didn't represent the king, but spelled his name? This single assumption broke every rule. Because if hieroglyphs could spell a foreign name, then they had to represent sounds, not ideas, not metaphors, sounds. Champollion began comparing cartouches across different inscriptions: Ptolemaios, Cleopatra, Alexander, different names, shared symbols. Patterns began to emerge. A lion appeared again and again in the same position. A circle with a dot repeated across royal names. Certain signs behaved consistently. They weren't decorative. They were phonetic markers. This was the moment where everything changed. Champollion realized that hieroglyphs were not one system. They were several systems layered together. Some signs represented full words, ideas, or concepts others represented. Syllables, individual sounds, and some signs existed only to clarify meaning. Silent, but essential. A writing system more complex than Latin, more flexible than Greek, and far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The implications were enormous. If Champollion was right, then centuries of interpretation were wrong. Hieroglyphs were not mystical pictures. They were a functional, living language. And ancient Egyptians were not hiding meaning behind symbols. They were writing, deliberately, precisely, and intelligently. In 1822, after years of intense work, Champollion reached a breaking point. While comparing inscriptions, he suddenly recognized a sequence of sounds that matched known Coptic words. The language clicked. According to historical accounts, he rushed into his brother's office, shouted, "I've got it!" and then collapsed from exhaustion. Whether the collapse was literal or symbolic, one thing was certain: ancient Egypt had just started speaking again. Later that year, Champollion presented his findings publicly. For the first time, hieroglyphs were read aloud, correctly. Kings had names, prayers had structure, texts had grammar. Egypt was no longer silent, but Champollion himself was cautious. He knew this was only the beginning. Decoding a language doesn't mean understanding a civilization. Reading words doesn't guarantee understanding meaning, especially in a culture where writing, religion, and symbolism were inseparable. Champollion didn't claim to have unlocked all of Egypt. He claimed something more precise and more powerful. That ancient Egyptians spoke a language we could finally hear again. What that language truly meant, that was a question for generations to come. In the next part, we'll explore what hieroglyphs actually revealed and what they may have kept hidden. Once hieroglyphs could finally be read, expectations were enormous. For centuries, people had imagined ancient Egypt as a civilization of hidden wisdom, lost sciences, and forbidden knowledge. Many believed that once the symbols were translated, Egypt would reveal secrets far beyond history. The reality was more complex. The first thing hieroglyphs revealed was not mystery, but daily life. Lists of offerings, records of grain, legal decrees, titles and names. Walls spoke of work, family taxes, disputes, celebrations. Ancient Egypt suddenly felt human. Not mythical, not magical, human. Hieroglyphs also revealed an obsession with order. Everything had its place: society, nature, gods, the afterlife. This principle was known as ma'at, balance, truth, and cosmic order. To live rightly was to maintain balance. To rule was to preserve it. To die was to be judged by it. This wasn't superstition. It was a worldview. Religion, once translated, became clearer, but also more layered. Texts described gods not as abstract forces, but as personalities, with relationships, conflicts, emotions. The afterlife was not vague. It was structured. Rituals mattered. Words mattered. Names mattered. Because to name something was to give it power. One of the most famous texts translated was the Book of the Dead. Despite its modern name, it wasn't a single book. It was a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions meant to guide the dead through the afterlife. What shocked scholars was not the magic, but the logic. The soul had parts. The heart was weighed. Morality mattered. Judgment wasn't arbitrary. It was earned. Hieroglyphs also revealed surprisingly advanced knowledge. Medical papyri described surgeries, diagnoses, treatments. Astronomical texts tracked stars' cycles, seasons. Mathematics governed. Architecture, land division, timekeeping. Ancient Egypt was not primitive. It was methodical. But as more and more texts were translated, a pattern emerged. Most surviving inscriptions fell into two categories: official, royal decrees, titles, propaganda, monuments; ritual, prayers, hymns, funerary texts, temple offerings. Something was missing. What scholars did not find were detailed explanations of how sacred knowledge was taught, how priests were initiated, how rituals were understood internally. There were no manuals saying, "This symbol means this," at a deeper level. "This ritual changes consciousness. This knowledge is for initiates only." Instead, hieroglyphs described what to do, not why it worked. This led to an uncomfortable realization. Hieroglyphs were never meant to explain everything. They were part of a living system, one that relied on oral teaching, ritual practice, direct experience. Reading the words was only one layer. Understanding them required context that no longer existed. In other words, translation gave us access, but not initiation. We could read prayers, but not feel what the priests felt. We could describe rituals, but not experience what they were designed to produce. The language returned. The system did not. This doesn't mean hieroglyphs failed. It means they were doing exactly what they were meant to do: preserve structure, preserve order, preserve tradition, not explain inner knowledge to outsiders. So by the mid-19th century, something strange had happened. Ancient Egypt was readable again, but it was also clear that reading was not the same as understanding. We had recovered voices, but not the full conversation. In the final part, we'll ask the hardest question of all. Did we truly decode ancient Egypt, or only the surface of its knowledge? By the mid-19th century, ancient Egypt could finally be read again. Its names were known, its prayers translated, its history reconstructed. From the outside, the mystery seemed solved. But quietly, a deeper question began to emerge. If we can read the words, why does ancient Egypt still feel so distant? Because something crucial had not returned. Context. Hieroglyphs gave us access to language, but not to experience. They told us what was done. They recorded what was said. They preserved what was required. But rarely did they explain why. This was not an accident. Ancient Egyptian knowledge was never meant to be fully written down. It was layered. One layer for the public, one for the educated, and one for the initiated. Hieroglyphs were part of that structure, not textbooks, not explanations, but keys, usable only by those who already understood the system. Temples were not just places of worship. They were spaces of transformation. Architecture, sound, darkness, light, ritual movement, all work together to create experience, not information. What was taught there was not simply known, it was felt. And that kind of knowledge does not survive translation. This explains something that often confuses modern audiences. Why Egyptian texts seem repetitive, why rituals feel mechanical, why prayers repeat the same formulas again and again. They were not meant to educate, they were meant to activate. When modern scholars read these texts, they read them like books. Ancient Egyptians lived them like processes. That difference matters. Even the gods themselves reflect this divide. They are not distant cosmic abstractions. They are principles, processes, states of being, order and chaos, life and death, becoming and decay. To name a god was not to describe a being. It was to engage with a force. This is why some chambers deep inside temples were never meant to be seen by the public. No inscriptions explaining their function. No instructions carved into stone. Only space, silence, and experience. Modern visitors walk through ruins and ask, "What does this mean?" Ancient priests asked a different question. What does this do? This brings us to a difficult realization. Champollion gave us the ability to read ancient Egypt, but he did not, and could not, give us access to the system that once gave those words life. The language returned. The world it belonged to did not. And so we are left with a strange paradox. Ancient Egypt is one of the most visible civilizations in history. Its monuments stand. Its texts survive. Its symbols endure. Yet something essential remains, unreachable. Not because it was hidden, but because it was never meant to be preserved outside living practice. This doesn't mean the ancient Egyptians possessed secret technology or forbidden science. It means they understood something modern culture often forgets, that not all knowledge is informational. Some knowledge is experiential, and when the experience disappears, the meaning fades with it. So when we ask whether ancient Egypt has been decoded, the answer depends on what we mean by decoding. If decoding means reading symbols, then yes. If decoding means fully understanding a civilization, then no. Perhaps ancient Egypt was never meant to be fully recovered. Perhaps its purpose was not to be explained, but to be remembered. What if the greatest loss wasn't the language, but the way of thinking that once gave it meaning?